The night it happened, I remember noticing the quiet before anything else. Not the comfortable kind, but the kind that settles in after a sentence lands wrong. One moment we were laughing on his bed, half-dressed, music low, the room warm and familiar. The next, the air felt heavier, like I had said something offensive without realizing it. All I had said was, "Can you put on a condom?" He didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He just stopped. He leaned back, exhaled sharply, and stared at the ceiling like the mood had been physically pulled out of him. When he finally looked at me, his expression wasn't angry. It was distant, disappointed, almost irritated in a way that made my stomach twist. "I don't know," he said. "It kind of kills it for me." That was the moment my confusion began. We had been together for almost a year, not casually either. We had met in college, bonded over late-night talks and shared routines, and slowly slipped into something that felt stable. He was affectionate in public, gentle in private, and until that moment, I believed we were on the same page about intimacy. I had never made a big deal about condoms before. I wasn't dramatic about it. I didn't accuse him of anything. I simply asked, but the way he reacted made me feel like I had crossed some invisible line. He sat up, pulled his shirt back on, and said, "I just thought you trusted me." That sentence stayed with me long after he left the room. I tried to explain. I told him it wasn't about trust. It was about comfort, about responsibility, about the fact that I wasn't on hormonal birth control and didn't want to be, about the fact that I was 20 and still figuring out my own boundaries. He listened, but not in the way someone listens when they want to understand. He listened like someone waiting for their turn to respond. "I've never had to do this with anyone else," he said. "It just makes it feel different. Different from what I wanted to ask. Different from safe." Instead, I apologized. Not because I thought I was wrong, but because the silence made me nervous. Because I didn't want to be the person who ruined the night. Because part of me wondered if I was overreacting. We didn't have sex that night. After that, things shifted in small ways. He didn't initiate as often. When he did, there was an unspoken tension, like the question was hovering between us. Sometimes he'd make jokes about it, light and dismissive, but they landed wrong. "You're really serious about this, huh? You're acting like I'm some stranger. You know condoms don't feel the same." Each comment chipped away at my certainty. I started questioning myself. I asked friends if I was being unreasonable. Some said no. It was normal. Others shrugged and said couples compromise. One even asked why I didn't just go on birth control to avoid the problem. But the problem wasn't contraception. The problem was how small I felt for asking. One night, a few weeks later, the conversation came back up. This time, I didn't soften my words. "I need this to feel safe," I said. "If that's a deal breaker for you, I need to know." He went quiet again. That same expression crossed his face, the one that made me feel like I was asking for too much. "I just don't get why you're making this such a big thing," he said. "It makes me feel like you don't want me." That was when it clicked. This wasn't about a condom. It was about control over the situation, about whose comfort mattered more, about how easily my boundary became an inconvenience. I didn't accuse him. I didn't yell. I just said, "I'm allowed to decide what I'm comfortable with." He nodded, but it wasn't agreement. It was resignation. After that, the relationship slowly unraveled. Not dramatically, just quietly. Less affection, more distance. Conversations that felt careful instead of open. Eventually, we broke up. When I told people why, the reactions were mixed. Some said I dodged a red flag. Others asked if I could have handled it differently, been more flexible, been more understanding of his feelings. And that's why I'm still thinking about it. I didn't shame him. I didn't force him. I didn't demand anything beyond my own comfort. But part of me wonders if I should have tried harder to meet him halfway. So now I'm asking myself the question that won't leave me alone. Am I the asshole for asking my boyfriend to wear a condom, even if it turned him off and eventually cost us the relationship? After the breakup, the quiet felt different than I expected. It wasn't dramatic emptiness or relief all at once. It was a steady, unnerving calm that forced me to think about what had actually happened instead of what I wished had happened. I replayed the moments leading up to the end, not the argument itself, but everything around it. The pauses, the jokes, the way my boundary had slowly become a point of tension rather than something to be respected. What bothered me most wasn't that he didn't want to wear a condom. People People are allowed to have preferences. What stayed with me was how quickly my comfort became secondary, how easily my no was framed as rejection rather than self-protection. I remembered how Head said it made him feel unwanted. That sentence had lodged itself deep in my head. I kept dissecting it, trying to understand why it made me feel guilty. I had asked for something reasonable, something common, something that directly affected my body and my future. Yet somehow I had ended up comforting him. That pattern wasn't new. Looking back, I realized this wasn't the first time my needs had been treated as obstacles. I had adjusted before. I had been flexible before. I had stayed quiet before. The condom conversation just happened to be the moment where the imbalance became impossible to ignore. Friends weighed in with their opinions. Some were firm. They said it was a clear boundary and that his reaction was a red flag. Others were more hesitant. They asked if he might have felt insecure, if maybe I could have reassured him more, if maybe I should have framed it differently. But every version of maybe ended in the same place. Why was it my responsibility to manage his reaction to my boundary? I thought about how young I was, how easily I internalized the idea that relationships required sacrifice, compromise, and understanding. Those things are true, but only when they move in both directions. Compromise doesn't mean overriding your own safety. Understanding doesn't mean ignoring your instincts. What scared me was how close I came to giving in. There had been a moment, lying next to him in the dark, where I considered dropping the issue just to restore peace, just to feel wanted again, just to avoid the tension. That realization unsettled me more than the breakup itself. Because if I had crossed that line, it wouldn't have been the last one. Over time, my doubts softened into clarity. I stopped asking whether I had handled it better and started asking whether I had been honest. The answer was yes. I had said what I needed, calmly and directly. I had given him space to respond. He responded by withdrawing. That was information. I learned that someone being turned off by your boundaries is not a misunderstanding. It's compatibility revealing itself. Desire that depends on silence is fragile. Intimacy that collapses under communication was never as strong as it felt. Months later, when I thought about dating again, I noticed something had changed. I wasn't afraid of stating my needs early. I wasn't apologizing for them. I trusted myself more, not because the situation had been easy, but because I hadn't betrayed myself to avoid discomfort. Sometimes I still wondered how he told the story. Maybe in his version, I was cold, paranoid, overreacting. Maybe he believed I didn't trust him enough. I learned to be okay with that, because my version wasn't about him failing. It was about me choosing to listen to my own voice when it mattered. And now, when I ask myself the question that once kept me awake at night, the answer comes quietly but clearly. I wasn't wrong for asking. I wasn't wrong for holding my ground. And I wasn't wrong for letting go when my boundary became a problem. If that makes me the asshole in someone else's story, I can live with it. In mine, it was the moment I learned that my comfort is not optional, and my body is not a compromise. As the months passed, the situation stopped feeling like a single incident and started to look more like a lesson that kept unfolding. I noticed how often I had minimized myself in the relationship without realizing it, not just physically, but emotionally. I learned his moods, his rhythms, the moments when it was better to stay quiet instead of asking questions. I had confused adaptability with maturity. I thought being easygoing meant being a good partner, but what I'd actually been doing was making myself smaller so the relationship could stay comfortable. The condom conversation just exposed that dynamic in a way I couldn't ignore. It was the first time I said no clearly without cushioning it with humor or reassurance. And the result wasn't discussion or compromise. It was withdrawal. That told me something important. I began to understand that consent isn't just about saying yes or no in the moment. It's about whether your boundaries are met with respect or resistance, whether your comfort is seen as essential or negotiable, whether intimacy is built on mutual care or conditional acceptance. I remembered how I had framed it as attraction fading, as if my boundary had somehow altered who I was to him. That hurt more than I admitted at the time. It made me feel like my value was tied to how accommodating I could be. Once that thought settled in, it became impossible to unsee. I talked about it with a therapist, carefully at first, then more honestly. She asked me a question that stuck with me. If your best friend told you this story, what would you say to her? The answer came easily. I'd tell her she did nothing wrong. I'd tell her she was allowed to protect herself. I'd tell her that anyone who treats safety like a mood killer isn't ready for real intimacy. It took longer to say those things to myself. Dating again was strange. I noticed how alert I was to reactions, how closely I watched for discomfort when I stated preferences. But instead of being afraid, I felt steadier. I didn't test people or challenge them. I simply paid attention to how they responded, and the difference was clear. Some people asked questions. Some said, of course. Some didn't make it a conversation at all. No tension, no sulking, no guilt. That's when it fully clicked. What I'd experienced before wasn't normal friction. It was misalignment. It was someone prioritizing their experience over my autonomy and framing it as emotional harm. When I didn't comply, I stopped wondering whether I could have saved the relationship, because saving it would have meant teaching myself that my comfort was optional. I also stopped carrying shame about how young I was, how unsure I'd felt. Learning boundaries doesn't mean you failed earlier. It means you're growing. Sometimes, late at night, I still thought about him, not with longing, but with a quiet curiosity. I wondered if he ever reflected on it, if he ever realized how that moment looked from my side, or if he still believed the story where I was overly cautious and he was misunderstood. I no longer needed to know, because the most important thing I took from that relationship wasn't heartbreak or bitterness. It was clarity, the kind that reshapes how you see yourself. I learned that desire without respect is not intimacy, that attraction that disappears at a boundary was never secure, and that protecting your body is not a rejection of someone else. It's an affirmation of yourself. And once you understand that, you don't unlearn it. With that understanding came a quieter kind of confidence, one that didn't announce itself but settled into my daily decisions. I stopped rehearsing explanations in my head before stating what I wanted. I stopped bracing for disappointment every time I asserted a preference. I no longer treated my boundaries as fragile things that needed to be defended with perfect logic. They were mine. That was enough. I also began noticing how often conversations around sex and relationships center someone else's comfort by default. How quickly people frame women's boundaries as fears to be overcome, inconveniences to be negotiated, or issues to be solved instead of decisions to be respected. I'd absorbed those ideas without questioning them. I'd believed that being desirable meant being flexible, that intimacy required me to prove trust rather than practice it. That belief didn't disappear overnight. It unraveled slowly, through small moments, through saying no and not explaining, through watching how people responded when I didn't soften my words, through realizing that the right people didn't need convincing. I thought back to the night he said it killed the mood. How final that statement had felt, like desire was a fragile switch that my request had flipped off. At the time, I'd taken that as evidence that I'd done something wrong. Now I saw it differently. The mood hadn't died because of the condom. It died because the moment required care, and he chose frustration instead. That distinction mattered. I also recognized how easy it would have been to stay. To tell myself it wasn't worth losing the relationship over something so small. To convince myself that love meant compromise even when the compromise lived entirely in my body. The scary part wasn't that I'd asked. It was that I'd almost agreed. That realization made me more compassionate toward myself, not harsher. I understood how deeply social conditioning runs, how it trains you to doubt your instincts and prioritize harmony over safety. I wasn't weak for hesitating. I was learning. Over time, the question, "Am I the asshole?" stopped feeling like an accusation and started feeling like a mirror. Not to judge myself, but to check whether I'd abandoned myself again. It became less about whether others approved and more about whether I could recognize my own limits. If I'm honest, part of me still wished had reacted differently. That had said, okay, without pause. That had shown me, in that moment, that my comfort mattered to him as much as his pleasure mattered to himself. That version of him existed only in my hopes, not in reality. Letting go of that imagined version was its own kind of grief. But grief passed, and what remained was something sturdier than reassurance. Self-trust. I didn't walk away because I wanted to be right. I walked away because I wanted to be safe, respected, and heard. And now, When I look back on that moment, the quiet, the ceiling, the way the air shifted, I no longer feel shame or doubt. I feel clarity. I see the exact point where I chose myself, even though it scared me. If that choice makes me difficult, demanding, or unromantic in someone else's story, I accept it. Because in my own story, it's the moment I stopped negotiating my autonomy and started treating it as non-negotiable. What surprised me most was how that clarity began to influence parts of my life. That had nothing to do with sex or dating. I became more aware of how often I had been performing comfort for others. At work, with friends, even with family. I noticed how easily I said yes to avoid awkwardness. How often I explained myself to preempt disagreement. How quickly I took responsibility for other people's reactions. The relationship hadn't created those habits, but it had relied on them, and losing it forced me to confront that. I thought about how my boyfriend had framed his discomfort as something I caused, how my request became the problem instead of his reaction to it. That pattern echoed in smaller interactions I'd ignored for years. Moments where my needs were met with sighs, jokes, or subtle withdrawal. Moments where I learned that being low maintenance earned approval. I stopped chasing that approval, not dramatically, not overnight, just quietly in the choices I made when no one was watching. I let people be disappointed without rushing to fix it. I let silence exist without filling it. I let myself feel uncomfortable without assuming I was wrong. And each time nothing terrible happened, I realized that healthy relationships don't rely on you constantly proving your good intentions. They don't punish boundaries with distance. They don't treat safety as negotiable or attraction as conditional. What hurt the most, looking back, wasn't the breakup itself. It was the moment I apologized for asking. That apology stayed with me longer than anything he said. It represented how deeply I'd internalized the idea that my needs were burdensome. Forgiving myself for that took time. There were moments of anger too. Not explosive, but slow and reflective. Anger at the way the situation had been framed to make me doubt myself. Anger at how normalized it is to pressure someone quietly instead of respecting them openly. Anger at how easily people excuse discomfort when it benefits them. But that anger didn't consume me. It clarified me. I stopped romanticizing potential. I stopped falling in love with who someone could be if they tried harder or cared more. I started paying attention to how they responded when things weren't effortless. Because that's where truth lives. Eventually, the story stopped feeling like something I needed to explain or defend. It became something I understood, a turning point rather than a wound. A moment where I learned that desire that demands silence isn't desire worth keeping. I didn't lose a relationship because I asked for a condom. I lost a relationship because I refused to pretend my comfort was optional. And if I'm honest, that loss feels smaller every day. Because what I gained was the ability to trust myself, to recognize the difference between compromise and self-erasure, to understand that intimacy isn't about how much you're willing to give up, but how safe you feel being fully present. That knowledge didn't come easily, but it came honestly, and it's something I'll carry forward long after his reaction fades into memory. With that understanding, I stopped trying to compress the story into a simple lesson. Real life rarely offers clean conclusions. What it gave me instead was perspective, layered and slow. I realized that part of why the situation lingered in my mind was because it challenged something I had quietly believed for a long time. That love, real love, should feel effortless. That if something felt hard or tense, it meant someone was doing something wrong. In that relationship, I had treated discomfort as a warning sign about myself instead of a signal about compatibility. But discomfort isn't always a failure. Sometimes it's information. The moment I asked him to wear a condom, I wasn't creating conflict. I was revealing it. His reaction didn't come out of nowhere, it had always been there, waiting for a moment when my needs conflicted with his expectations. That reframing mattered. I began to understand that attraction isn't just physical. It's emotional alignment. It's how someone responds when the moment stops being convenient. Anyone can be affectionate when things go their way. The real test is how they behave when they're asked to adjust, to care, to consider. And he didn't fail because he said no. He failed because he made my safety feel like a personal rejection. That distinction helped me release the lingering guilt. I stopped asking whether I had been too firm, too serious, too cautious. I started asking a better question. Would I want to be with someone who only desired me when I stayed quiet? The answer came easily. I also noticed how often people frame these situations as misunderstandings rather than mismatches, as if better communication would have fixed it, as if the right words could have turned resistance into respect. But communication only works when both people value the same things. I had valued safety, agency, and mutual care. He had valued spontaneity, comfort, and not being challenged. Neither of those makes someone inherently bad, but together they don't make a healthy relationship. That realization allowed me to hold the story without bitterness. I didn't need to villainize him to justify leaving. I didn't need to exaggerate the harm to prove my point. The truth was enough. I also learned something quieter but just as important. Boundaries don't always feel empowering in the moment. Sometimes they feel lonely. Sometimes they feel awkward and heavy and isolating. The empowerment comes later when you look back and recognize that you didn't abandon yourself. That night, on his bed, with the room suddenly too quiet, I could have stayed. I could have apologized more convincingly. I could have folded myself into something easier to want. I didn't, and even though it cost me the relationship, it gave me something far more stable than reassurance or desire. It gave me self-respect. I don't carry this story to prove a point or to win an argument. I carry it because it taught me what I'm no longer willing to negotiate. Because it showed me that intimacy built on pressure will always collapse under honesty. So when I ask myself now, with distance and clarity, whether I was wrong for asking, the answer doesn't come with anger or defensiveness. It comes with calm. I wasn't wrong for asking. I wasn't wrong for standing still when the room shifted. And I wasn't wrong for walking away when my boundary became a problem. Some relationships don't end because of one moment. They end because one moment finally tells the truth. What lingered after all of this wasn't resentment, but awareness. The kind that doesn't announce itself loudly, but quietly rewires how you move through the world. I started noticing how often people confuse discomfort with wrongdoing. How quickly a boundary becomes framed as an accusation. How often women, especially young women, are expected to translate their needs into something more palatable, so others don't feel challenged by them. I had done that translation instinctively for years. This time, I hadn't, and the reaction revealed more than any long conversation ever could. I thought about how easily the situation could be simplified by outsiders. It's just a condom. It's just sex. It's not worth ending a relationship over. But none of those people had been in my body. None of them had felt the subtle pressure of that moment. The way the atmosphere changed not because I said no, but because I said it clearly. What stayed with me most was how fast intimacy evaporated once I asserted myself. Not slowly, not gradually, immediately. That told me something I couldn't unlearn. Desire that depends on compliance is conditional. I also realized how much I had mistaken familiarity for safety. We'd been together long enough that I assumed my comfort mattered to him, simply because he cared about me. But care isn't proven by time spent. It's proven by response. And when my comfort conflicted with his desire, his response was to withdraw rather than adjust. That wasn't cruelty, but it wasn't care either. In the weeks after, I caught myself rehearsing explanations I would never give. Imagine conversations where I said the perfect sentence that made him understand, where he apologized, where he said he hadn't realized how it came across, where the story softened. But each imagined version required him to become someone else. Letting go of that fantasy was harder than letting go of him, because the truth was simpler and less dramatic. We reached a point where what I needed made him uncomfortable, and instead of sitting with that discomfort, he made it my responsibility. I stopped asking whether he was wrong and started asking whether I felt safe being myself around him. The answer was no, and once you see that clearly, there's nothing left to negotiate. I don't think he woke up intending to pressure me. I don't think he saw himself as manipulative. I think he genuinely believed that his reaction was reasonable, that attraction is fragile, that chemistry can be broken by pause or a request. But that belief alone made us incompatible, because I believe intimacy should survive conversation. I believe desire should make room for care. I believe safety should never be framed as a sacrifice. Walking away wasn't dramatic. It wasn't empowering in the way movies make it look. It was quiet, steady, and sad in a way that felt adult. But it was also honest. And honesty, I've learned, doesn't always feel good in the moment. Sometimes it just feels necessary. One didn't leave because I wanted to be difficult. One didn't leave because I wanted to be right. I left because I finally understood that staying would mean teaching myself to ignore my own instincts, and that was a lesson I refused to learn. That is where the story ends, not with a dramatic confrontation or a sudden realization from his side, but with a quiet decision on mine. I didn't need him to admit fault. I didn't need him to change his mind or validate my feelings. I only needed to know whether I could live with the version of myself I was becoming in that relationship. And I couldn't. I learned that a boundary doesn't need to be extreme to be real. It doesn't need to come with anger or ultimatums to matter. Sometimes it's just a simple request, and the way it's received tells you everything you need to know. I didn't lose him because I asked for too much. I lost him because I refused to ask for less than what I needed. If that makes me the asshole in his story, I accept that. I'm no longer interested in being easy to love at the cost of my own safety and self-respect. The relationship ended, but something else began. I walked away knowing that my body is not a negotiation, my comfort is not a mood killer, and my boundaries are not an inconvenience. And that certainty is something I won't give up again.